Hi, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome Dr. Dolly Kikon for a conversation. She may not remember, but she is back with doing sociology for the second time. Although the last time she was here, she was a panelist in a book discussion, and this time we have the chance to speak to her one to one. The title of the conversation is Land, Resources, and Nature in Northeast India, Ethnographic Explorations with Dolly Kikon. Just to briefly introduce the speaker, she is an anthropologist and teaches in the Anthropology and Development Studies program at the University of Melbourne. She received her PhD from the Department of Anthropology at Stanford University in 2013 and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at Stockholm University from 2013 to 15. Her research focuses on resource extraction, militarization, development, human rights, migration, gender, and political economy. Apart from several of her published works, both in popular press and academic press, her books include Living with Oil and Coal, Resource Politics and Militarization in Northeast India, Ceasefire City, Militarism, Capitalism, and Urbanism in Dimapur, co-authored with Duncan McDuie-Ra, Leaving the Land, Indigenous Migration and Affective Labor, co-authored with Bengt Karlsson, and Life and Dignity, Women's Testimonies of Sexual Violence in Dimapur. Dr. Kikon, I welcome you to this conversation and, look forward to having you answer our questions.
Thank you so much, Rituparna and Dipali, for having me. I'm very excited to have this moment to share my thoughts.
So, to begin with, as an author, what would you think are the key takeaways from your book, Living with Oil and Coal? You do talk about India's Northeast region as the living world of an extractive landscape. So what do you mean by that?
Thank you so much for encouraging me to talk about my my book, the monograph, which was my PhD thesis, then became a book. The journey to write the book actually, came, I would say, by a series of events which led to what the research was meant to be. I started out my PhD research journey trying to look at the hat bazaars, the weekly markets along the foothills of Assam and Nagaland. I was very drawn to the markets and the kind of exchanges, the kind of the relations that were there between the upland communities, the Nagas, and also, the people in the Brahmaputra Valley who would come, the Mishings, the Ahoms, a whole lot of, I think, indigenous people around Upper Assam. And the project, my research project started to shift when I kept noticing a lot of people who also came to the market, and they were from the security forces, they were from the oil rigs, and they were also from the plantations. There were a lot of tea plantations. There are a lot of tea plantations along these foothills. There was a moment, a very, very, I think, important moment which shifted my focus from the markets to the extractive regime, and it was the extrajudicial killing of my friend, brother. His name was Nilikesh Gogoi, who was a coal trader in the town of Geleki. And so when that happened, I began to see the foothills in a very different way. And as you might know, that a lot of my writings, till that time was on the Armed Forces Special Power Act, was on militarization and on human rights around. But with the extrajudicial killing of Nilikesh Gogoi by the CISF, who were guarding the tea plantations, the militarization of the land not only came to the forefront, but also how extraction and resource extraction was tied to the land that we call home for all of us. And it also tied, I think, the connection of colonialism, of indentured labor, and of horribly marginalized citizens along these foothills. And I think that's when the spaces opened up. One of the key things that helped me shape the book was social relations, and in chapter 3 I write about love, and I called it morom, and it's a term in Nagamese which is which is spoken across the foothills of Assam and Nagaland, and it came up as a market language. And so if you look at the Arunachal Assam borders, or today even the Nagaland Assam borders, a lot of mixed communities would speak this language. And so I would say that if you're reading my book, Living with Oil and Coal, to request you to go to chapter 3 and realize that, as a writer, I began to write different chapters at different points, but it was really the chapter on love that kind of pulled the thread to the entire book. And for me as a writer, then I began to see how is it that affection, social relations, what we call friendships, and what we call hostilities are really determined and shaped by these extractive landscapes, including domestic violence and notions of purity. And so in a sense, that helped me to really develop and think about land. Right? What do we do with land? We do so many different things with land. We are born into a space that we call land, and then we live throughout our lives, and then we die. But what is the relation that we have? When do things around us become resources? When do things around us become property? When does it become inheritance? When does it become memory? So I was playing around with these terms and these reflections, and I began to see, and I began to realize that it is truly, I think everything around us is living, right? So I think it's the connection that we have, or the disconnect. And I think that is where violence and militarization comes in, of the deep soul disconnect that violence has normalized, has naturalized. So it's not as though a tree or a tea plant that is there, which then defines the lives of so many Adivasi workers, or even the birds that are there, flying across the oil rigs, the oil rigs that are set up in land where there are animals and villages displaced at the same time, right? So in terms of both the living landscape and its relation with extraction and violence, really made me see the world in both, I think, terms. One, how connected we are, and at the same time, how disconnected we are. And maybe as a writer, it was this sense of how aware and how awareness comes, I think, into our mind, and how does that translate into political consciousness, right? I think became a point. And the last point that I want to say is definitely it was also my feminist lens, as a Naga anthropologist looking at that. So even things like, and I'm sure a lot of young feminists, both male, female, would be able to understand what I'm saying, a plate of food, or something as simple as standing in the kitchen and cooking, right? Who is there? Which body is there? And I think the things that we normalize kind of, I think, began to come up to the surface and draw me into worlds which I'm still trying to figure out.
Thank you, Dr. Kikon, for that response. I think the one point really struck me was, how certain natural resources are, not just resources. And I think this is the question that I have for you. What is then the relationship between people and natural resources like coal in the region?
I think that's a very good question. And before maybe, we go into the realm of looking at the world around us as either resources or non-resources, or what do we do as human species with things around us, that also includes hydrocarbon. I think we need to maybe ask, what was our relationship with the land through the lens of our ancestors, and then I think figure out and come to a point when the land that we call our homes, became sites, or became frontiers, or became regions for natural resources. And I think that's also a very similar story in central India with Tata Steel coming up, right? With Adivasi people being displaced. If we look at Tata Steel really as, the amazing national company, in post-colonial India, what it hides is its relationship with tribal land and what happened there. And the Adivasi thinkers and scholars can tell us that story, which is very important. And in the same way, in the northeastern region of India as well, particularly whether it's Assam or whether it's the Naga areas, where there's a lot of coal mining happening, including Meghalaya. For me as an anthropologist, going back to the book, it was really fascinating to trace time back to a colonial period where there was a definition of coal, of oil, of corporations, and how that so deeply defined who we are today. The definition of the Naga people, my people, as barbarics, as primitives, as headhunters, actually came with Dipali, the demarcation of the land for natural resources, for exploitation. The definition that Assamese people are lazy, right? And they can't do anything else because they're so lazy that they needed settlers from migrants from elsewhere to come and settle in the Brahmaputra Valley so that they could do the work for the Britishers, for the planters, kind of really define and shape the politics of Assam today. So I think your question is very, very valid, and I might not have all the answers. But the moment our lands that we call home was actually defined and categorized as prime areas for natural resources, it really, really totally transformed our relationship, not only with land, not only between one community and the other, but today in post-colonial India, our relationship, a deeply fractured one, even with citizenship.
I think it's very interesting because I was also reminded of my own research when I was trying to look at migrants who, from say the Chota Nagpur region, who would always see land and they would write about it so beautifully, or they would sing about it because it's not just land, but it is so much more than that. And and in your own work, you look at, the question of land and how it is a form of living and nurturing pedagogy in the region. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Thank you so much for asking me the question. I got the courage to write about land in a different way and not make the land a dried one, right? Where we are constantly looking at it as a resource to sustain us. I got the courage to write about land, in many forms, by engaging with Australian Indigenous writings. Right? And I think there are many Indigenous, communities who look at land as as a being that is living, and secondly, the beings on the land that are there, as having a relationship with. So I'll just give you this small example. The problem that we are having really in the academy and as thinkers and as researchers is that we are really not questioning our epistemological and our ontological frameworks when we are working with that. And by that, I mean, is the land living or dead? If you ask a settler colonial white person, they would say no, right? It's just there to go and extract. It's a virgin natural land, that God-given land, right? In terms of Western philosophy. And if we are getting into that water, we have to be very, very mindful, I've realized, right? In terms of our foundations to do with what is the basis of land. The moment I'm saying as Dolly, as a writer, as an anthropologist, and the moment you're saying as, Dipali as talking about land, and we choose a particular stream, the land is living, we have to carry it through. And that will lead us to a path of looking at what kind of epistemological, what kind of knowledge production, what kind of existing knowledge we are taking on then, right? To shape and to create that world. And I think for me, the more I think about land as living, the more I think about the entire world of our ancestors, of the tribal indigenous world, as a very important political site for us to write and think about. And I'll tell you, for an example, what it means. For the longest time, the kind of Adivasi indigenous performances or the rituals that we would do, offerings in the Jhum field, whether to do with, feeding ants, talking to birds, Pre-harvest, let's say, like the Bihu rituals in the Brahmaputra Valley, post-harvest rituals, like I belong to the Lotha Naga tribe, and we have a post-harvest ritual called a festival called the Tukuemu, and it's a festival of reconciliation and a forgiveness, and it comes from the Jum field tradition, where it is accepted that, you know, when you're in the middle of sowing, tending the June fields and harvesting, people are bound to clash and have differences, right? Sometimes, you know, there are conflicts that arise in such agrarian settings. The post-harvest festival is meant to tie reconciliation into it. In this world as we see today, right now, in the academy, the way we write about indigenous worlds is absolutely plain and shallow and also very, very thin. And I think that's why I'm going back to this kind of epistemological frameworks. I call epistemological frameworks not as simply academic frameworks, but as political decisions that we have to make. Because this is an absolutely insidious world where we are entering, and our students need to know that. The moment you hold on to a Eurocentric settler colonial point of view and you enter that, you know, that's a realm you're bound to lose, right? You are really going into the amphitheater of the lions without no story of your own, without the story of colonization and what it has done to our land and our people. And I think that becomes very, very important for us then to make sure that, going back to the question of the living land, to make sure that everything that's around us is brought to life. Okay, I need to be cautious here because I might be blamed for being romantic, you know, for being absolutely ulala, you know, for living in the air and saying, you know, oh, look at her, she's talking about the spirit world, the animal world, all that doesn't matter. When did it stop mattering to us? That's the question that we need to answer then, as researchers, as writers, really working on absolutely complex colonial violent past of what happened to our land, what happened to our people, and how is it that today we have been reduced to such marginal and marginalized voices, whether it's in the intellectual debates around in South Asia or in the global scheme of things, where, you know, we are talking about ideas and about research.
I feel like every response could be a separate conversation with you. And, you know, it's, yeah, because, you know, I don't know how to sort of frame my next question, because you've worked so much on food and, of course, also on the relationship of food, Northeast India. But my question is about how nature sort of determines people's relationship with resources like food in the region, you know.
Thank you, Rituparna. I know you also dabble with food, like a devil with food, and we are all thinking about food in different ways. And I feel that as researchers, food is such an important topic. It always has been, right? Whether in sociology or anthropology or literature, you know, the kind of, I think, the kind of process where we take food as a framework to see the world. Wow, so you're touching on a topic, you know, where my current research is located. And so I would like to say that political ecology and the seasons and going back, I think going back to sources become important. And here, when it comes to food, I would say that it really opens up a space for us, because one of the struggles and one of the debate that I have with historians is around evidence. Right? A lot of historians would say they can't write indigenous histories. They can't write indigenous people into history. And especially it happens a lot in the discipline of history because they're just not there in the archives. What did they leave behind? Right? What did they leave behind? And of course, you know, I have my take on that. I disagree, because when it comes to history and how do we look at evidence, is the archive the only way to look at evidence? For me as an anthropologist, food is such an important part. Right? Food is such an important part. So I think in terms of looking at food in my own work, I've very closely paid attention to seasons, to taste, to embodied practices. And so my first work on food that I wrote for the I think, American anthropological newsletter called, I think it's called Anthropology. Yeah, Anthropology News was a very short piece, and it was called Tasty Transgressions. And like I said, I started my entire PhD like desiring to look at the Hat Bazaar, which then went on to only become a chapter in my book. I went on to look at tasty transgressions, where people were having a lot of different food practices in the foothills. Around, I think, 5 years later, I wrote that article, which is used quite a lot by students and teachers all over. It's called Fermenting Modernity, putting akuni on the nation's table. So that allowed me, fermented food allowed me to draw on racism, on discrimination, on migrants. I think Dipali's work, for instance, right, on how migrants are really unable to even find places around Delhi. And Rituparna, I know you've written on that as well, right? In terms of, and as scholars, in Delhi, as professors, you all talk constantly about that. And that is a true experience. So that really helped me through food, kind of like teasing out the different strands of citizenship, of discrimination. So maybe we can have more conversations on that. But yeah, food has become an important lens for me to think about, I think, the world around us, about citizenship. My most current work is on food sovereignty in the Eastern Himalayas, and it includes 4 countries, Nepal, Bangladesh, Northeast India, and Bhutan. And I have just written a draft of a new work, of a new concept, an ethnography that I'm thinking about with my team. And it's called, I'm very excited about this work. It's called Guns to Grains. Yeah, and this is something that I'm going to tease out and see, okay, with food, where can we go, right? Because food at the end determines a community sovereignty, and how sovereign you can be is linked to whether you can grow your own food and whether your economy can be self-sufficient. So I think food leads us to absolutely radical political ways of seeing the world.
On that note, I would have asked you 10 more questions on food, but keeping in mind the paucity of time, you have an article titled The Rehabilitation Zone, Living with Lemons and Elephants in Assam. And like all your articles and the titles, this one is also very interesting. So you look at lemon farming and how it helps in restoration and trauma building. As an economic activity, how does lemon farming do that?
Oh, that that all my works are close to my heart because these are in relation to engagements that I've done with communities and increasingly with students that I mentor, and I look up to, because they'll write more than me, I know, and they'll do so much better than me. So I'm very, very excited. I would say that this was an article that actually marks a turning point in my life as a writer, as a thinker, as a researcher, because this is the article where you begin to see animals and other beings in my work. And it's also close to my heart because I co-authored it with my partner, Professor Sanjay Borbera. And the idea came through my 2 students, Brojo and Beauty. So Brojo and Beauty, after they graduated, they finished their masters, they went back to Boroland. They are both from the Boro community, and they were first generation ecologists in looking at conservation. And they both went to Manas to work. One winter they invited us. They said, come to Manas, we'll show you around. And that's where the idea came up, because the stories that Brojo and Beauty were telling us about the community really made me think about how do we bring this story together. As you know, the entire Manas landscape, it's a national park, and the entire landscape and the communities have gone through a lot of violence, because of the insurgency in Boroland. But that place is also kind of, part of the elephant corridor. And so imagine that was the first time, like the book, where I began to think about resource extraction. And even here in living with lemons and elephants, it was Brojo and Beauty who were really having that conversation with us to open up, our world as thinkers, to include other beings. And I began to see that because of deforestation, because of displacement of animal habitat, elephants across Assam and across the northeast is always on front page news because they come to now human habitations all the time. And imagine if you have villages along the elephant corridor in a place like Manas, the frequency is insane. So what they came up with was actually a biofence. So the lemon trees are biofences so that the elephants will not get into the villages. And this is proven, whether it's in the continent of Africa, along conservation, where you don't have to harm and kill the animals. But how do you cohabit? How do you coexist? Very, very hard things to do. But I think in this time and age, in the 21st century, they are not going anywhere. Right? Because us as human species, the amount of destruction that we have done, then they will keep coming back. In Guwahati as well, Rituparna is very, very common now to actually see elephants walking down the streets in Guwahati. And Guwahati, Dipali is the largest city in Northeast India. So when that happened around 5-6 years ago, it was like front page news. There were TV cameras following the elephant, but no more. Right? No more. People have gotten used to it. So when I was writing that article, in a sense, I think the lemons first as biofence became a very important point to understand. Second, the language that communities were using to talk to the animals. And I think that also made me reflect on language and how is it that, it's true if we think about human language as well. We use a different tone for animals. We constantly talk to dogs and cats and birds, right? And yet, what is the language that we use? I think thinking about that. And so I think these were really a lot of ideas that were coming up and stacking in living with lemons and elephants. And, I'm really happy that it resonated with people who do food studies. I'm sure a lot of people who are doing conservation write to me that they use that. And I have to tell you this story. So I was invited to give a lecture at a plenary conference, I think, a year and a half ago, and it was filled with conservation and science people. For us to be in the social sciences and humanities, we are not often invited to science, kind of like quote unquote pure science conferences, the technicalities. And so when they invited me, I gave a talk. I gave a talk on animal and pretty much this kind of conversation that we are having. And I think I would like to believe from the interaction and from the love and the affection that the students showed, all emerging scientists, they were so interested and fascinated with that world that communities have, particularly indigenous communities have, with conservation, with the animal world, with other species. So I would say that what we are doing is perhaps, not something that's up in the air, but something that's really making sense to also a lot of young scientists who are at times really desperate to see what is the indigenous epistemology of understanding conservation, right? What is the indigenous epistemology of understanding, for instance, climate change? A lot of the guidelines on climate change actually now has to take into consideration indigenous ways of dealing with the world, of negotiating and of adaptability.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Kikon. And next, I would like to talk about this very interesting article that you write, and it's the title is as interesting as the paper itself. It's called "Jackfruit Seeds from Jharkhand Being Adivasi in Assam." So how are ideas of Adivasi belonging and identity constructed in a political milieu where ideas of indigeneity and territoriality are deeply internalized? And could you talk about it, referring to this article that you've written?
Thank you so much for this question and also for referring to that article. So I would start by saying that the Adivasi plight in Assam is really a shame. It's really a shame. It's of national shame and embarrassment to the post-colonial state in India, right? And if India is celebrating this, its diaspora across the Pacific, a lot of them were actually from the same areas where the Adivasis today community in Assam claim their ancestry to. So whether it's in Fiji or, around the Solomon Islands, the kind of the plantation story and the kind of the plantation history that ties, I think, Adivasis to the eastern and to the central Indian homeland, Adivasi homeland, and kind of the mobility story is very similar. It's the same. Perhaps from one family, some of them, or from one king family, some of them went all the way to Fiji and others were brought to Assam. The second thing is that it's also, and I say that it's really a shame on the Indian states, kind of post-colonial story, because if you see the Adivasis who went overseas today are celebrated. I think one of the Fijian ministers or presidents, claimed an Indian ancestry from the Adivasi homelands. But that story is not, and the celebration doesn't happen with the Adivasis who came to Assam. And they did not come on their own. They were brought by British administrators and planters. They were endangered almost, they came and they worked in slave-like conditions. We have Guha, we have, I think, Bell's work to show us. And yet somehow, in terms of the citizenship and rights conversations, I feel that I would say it's a work of reparation, right? Because even within India, if we have to go back to the colonial past, Dipali, the Adivasi case in Assam actually calls us to reflect on reparation in post-colonial India and in the post-colonies. Now, the second thing that I want to say about this article that I wrote was talking to Adivasi families in the foothills and how they work on the land and how they claim a sense of belonging on the land. But they are very clear where the idea of the homeland is, because they have strong connections, whether to do with Eastern India or to do with Central India. And this was something that I was sitting down with them and learning. In terms of the claims to indigeneity, definitely, they claim a sense of indigeneity to the homelands that they come from, because they say that they have very strong relations, and they say it in their own words, that's where their ancestral roots are, right? That's where they go to pay homage to their ancestors. But in terms of citizenship rights, they claim that Assam is the place where they have citizenship rights and where they want their rights and benefits to take place. And that means whether it's to do with education, that means whether it's to do with affirmative action, which is all in the Constitution of India. That means whether it's about scholarships, right? That means whether it's about jobs. So I think in terms of the conversations that happen, it is absolutely very clear. One thing that I did not hear, and I think here, this is where I will separate indigeneity and being indigenous and citizenship. And in India, what we are often confusing are these two categories, because as indigenous people, Adivasi tribals, we are constantly dragged to the citizenship realm, where it has a very different rights and guarantees within the Constitution. The Constitution does not define or accept the term indigenous or indigeneity. India, with many countries, including China and Japan, refuses to accept the term. But whether they accept it or they don't accept it, I think the indigenous claims and kind of the indigenous right to self-determination is something that's absolutely right there at the center of the table. And the ongoing, the Indo-Naga political conversation and ceasefire is actually a huge, huge evidence of that. That today India cannot claim that the Nagas don't have a distinct history. Right? And that also goes with a lot of I think the ceasefire and the political negotiations that's happening. So one is the de jure pretense that's there, but the other one is a de facto kind of on the ground reality that's happening. So having said that, back to, I think, the Adivasi communities in Assam. The third point that I want to say is that there's a huge accountability issue for indigenous people themselves who claim indigeneity in the Northeast to make sure that they look and they introspect in terms of the relationship they have developed with the Adivasi people, the ancestors who were brought in as endangered workers, and what kind of relationship they had. And I think there's a lot of soul searching to be done. right? Because there's a lot of soul searching to be done if we have to create true alliances and true solidarities. Because the danger is this. Like many marginalized communities across, I think Adivasi communities as well, they come from different religions, they come from different spiritual practices, and it has been a gold mine for Hindu fundamentalists, for religious fundamentalists to actually get into those communities and work their own agenda, and work through how can I say, a framework of violence. So if you see, for instance, I work in the Assam Nagaland border. If you see a lot of the tea plantations around, not all Adivasi stay inside the plantations. They have their own villages, they have their own setups, they live in towns, cities, they are entrepreneurs, they are professors, right? They're doing extremely well. And yet what we need to see is the challenges of the community at really the grassroots level. And it's not only with the Adivasi people, but also with my own people like the Nagas, right? Where is our value? Where is our politics, right? How do you balance something like your Christian faith and being absolutely a sportsperson for the RSS? I'm sure there are ways that people do it, but how do you do it, right? In a lot of Assam Nagaland border conflicts, the Adivasi community, and especially the youth, are instrumentalized, right, by really very, very fundamentalist forces. They are fed so much violence and so much hatred that they go on rampage. But they are the most vulnerable youth. They don't have education. They're either school dropouts, right? And the kind of violence that we have used among Adivasi communities to bring them into this citizenship, to say, you can absolutely be citizen and claim equality if only you're practicing all the most hateful things, the most retrograde things, right, to be a citizen of India. And I think that's where we really need to go back as people, as researchers, and I think look at the foundational framework of violence that the post-colonial state has created for its most marginalized citizens, to say that you be crazy, right, kill one another, then only you can ask for an autonomous council. And that formula continues with the Adivasi communities as well. And I think it's on all of us to actually find a way, where social justice, like you say, truly, right, like issues of citizenship, indigeneity are really spoken and are really well thought out, in a sense that we are really looking at a future that's sustainable for Indigenous Adivasi people together.
Dr. Kikon, again, thank you for that very elaborate answer. You mentioned about your field, and I think our next question is connected to your fieldwork, because a lot of our listeners also are very young researchers who are maybe in the field now or are planning to go there. So, if you could share a little bit from your own experiences of doing fieldwork, particularly in Assam and Nagaland, and also if you could talk about your location as an insider, how do you then enter the field, and what are your experiences then, and maybe share some challenges that you faced while doing your field work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dipali, for this wonderful question. And I can talk about the field forever, and you will go off to sleep. And but yeah, I think I started so much before I became an anthropologist. I did my law, and before that I did history. So the field, what we call the field, and I think that's something for us as ethnographers, we know, right? It's really I don't even have to say, I feel embarrassed to say just basic things like, it's a field of power we're talking about, right? Territory and the land and communities come, but we all know that, and especially as women, we enter a field of power, which can be very sexist, which can be very violent at times, which can be absolutely disparaging, in terms of, for instance, I don't have kids, and when I go to the field, every time it's like, why don't you have kids? Your husband's going to leave you. Right? I get that all the time. So in a sense, the field also tries your patience, but at the same time also, allows you to build new connections. Okay. Having said that, my first field work that I did was through fact findings as a human rights activist, when I was in law school. And so the field was a very different, quote unquote, field for me. It was a place where you went to as an act of solidarity. It was a place where you went, in a sense, to sit with the people, right? It was a place where you went to take down witnesses, so that you could appeal to the state to say that, where are the rights and where are, what kind of violence is this? One thing that I realized very early on, and I think this is something I write about somewhere. I can share it with you. You can put it on the link. I've written about this somewhere in one of the pieces. I'm forgetting right now. I think it was in the Internationalist. Okay, I can send it to you. One thing about the field that I learned very early on was not from any professor sitting at Harvard or Stanford. Sorry, it was from my elders in the human rights movement. Right? And we have to accept one thing, that India has a very, very old civil and political rights culture. Right? And at least even till the 90s, and it still happens, it was really a relationship of mentoring and of alliance and solidarity. And so for those of us then who were in the human rights movement from the Northeast, one thing we learned very early on was to actually deal with boredom. And that's something that I don't see among kids, who directly come, from academic training. They're like, we can't be bored, right? From morning till evening, they think that field work is like breaking news, right? Like every moment has to be an explosion of, oh my God, look. Actually, you know what? The most, I think, I would say profound, not for us as writers and thinkers, but the most profound moment for human beings happen in the most ordinary ways. And what we often fail to see as researchers is our lack of patience and depth and understanding, because we are so tainted by theory and, and half of our waking hour, we are trying to be smart and outdo one another, that we don't realize at the end of our lives as writers and thinkers, we don't matter, right? What might matter, I'm saying might, is if we have been able to go to the source of understanding the profoundness of life and living and community making by the most ordinary acts, right? Of sharing, of giving, of forgiveness, of the realization that, my gosh, what I did might not be correct, might have hurt a community. And those moments doesn't come at once. Those moments come even after a decade or so. Those moments comes after 2 decades when you look at ethnic cleansing. Right? And some of the reports I did as a young human rights activist during my law school was actually to go to quote unquote ethnic cleansing areas in the Northeast and write reports. And very early on, I realized that, wow, and it'll be close to 30 years since I wrote some of the reports. I went to law school in 97, so I'm like, I went to grad school quite late, in that sense of being late as a senior student. And so one thing I realized about the field is that it stays on and people stay on, and we might write and get out, but the process of hurt, of forgiveness, of trying to stay together, and that is the time when, as writers, as researchers, we have to very quickly figure out, are we working from a place of radical hope, empathy, and compassion, active compassion, right? Or are we writing to provoke? Definitely, I'm sure there's a space for the provocateur as well, right? I don't deny them that space as thinkers and writers. But if we are working in such horrifying spaces with deep colonial violence, how do we do it? And I can only speak about my way and how I do it, right? And I think that is to linger on. I think to linger on and to understand not only conversations and amazing interviews. The other thing that I tell students is, don't be obsessed with getting the best interview. Don't be obsessed with chasing the block development officer SDO and getting that quote, right? Or I'm corrupt, or I embezzled 20 lakhs, and that's it, that's going to go in your thesis. Sorry, right? One has to contextualize it. Perhaps the video, the corrupt video, okay, let's have that figure. Escaping, right? Refusing to give you an interview, taking his car, his bicycle, and paddling away as soon as he or she sees you. That in itself is fieldwork. I wrote my book, Living with Oil and Coal, having extreme difficulty having access to oil people in Assam. I did not have connections. I don't come from an oil family. I don't have the Dulia Jan Okhomia upper caste connections. I can call my mama and I can have direct access to a Dulia Jan engineer. That's not me. I was working in Assam as a Naga, right? As a Naga researcher, looking at encountering caste, upper caste, touchability, untouchability, looking at Naga villagers who were really breaking down and doing coal mining. And so in a sense, I very, very quickly realized that what do we do and how do we figure out the field? And I think one thing that saved me, I would say, was really that process of reflecting on social relations. So if you go back and read my chapter, Difficult Love, it was a washerwoman, it was a help in a house who helped me think about the foothills. Right? And I think the onus and the accountability is on us as researchers. Who do we give so much attention to, right? And I think I'm particularly asking second, third, fourth generation researchers and writers to be very, very introspective at this moment. For us as first generation, both my parents didn't go to college, right? And I grew up with a single mom in a divorce household in a tribal society. You can imagine the violence that you go through. But that made me who I am. And I have many students today, Dipali, who can just pick up a phone and call the CEO of a company and have a discussion session with all the directors. Not because this kid has no authority, but because of the family that he or she or they come from. And trust me, so many researchers continue to do that. But I have bad news for them. That's not going to make you a smart researcher, right? I always say that, one of the things that I saw working in the tea plantations across the foothills in Assam was that the insider-outsider thing is quite tricky because an Adivasi student from the plantations will not have access to the manager's bungalow for an interview for research because it is so divided, right? He or she or they are as much insider as they are. I mean, the students' ancestors literally, started the plantation and manages that. But can you imagine the class, caste, and the hierarchical divide that happens? And so, in a sense, I have seen that very often, even in students who go to study the tea plantations in Assam. The class and the caste they come from shapes very deeply what kind of research they bring out. And that is the same even among tribal students. Right? It doesn't mean the tribal students are off. Sorry, man. They're off the hook. They constantly, if they come from upper class, well-networked families, they constantly use their connections to get quote unquote good data, which a lot of students might not have. So I bring bad news. I'm the bearer of bad news. The sharpness of your research and the depth of your research will not happen because you have access to quote unquote good data and you're smart and your father and your mother is well connected. Sorry, bad news for you all. You will do meaningful research if you're able to introspect and see where your humanity lies and what kind of solidarity and political consciousness you have.
I mean, both of us are teaching research methods as well. And, it's difficult to convince students to keep that hope when they say that respondents haven't really gotten back. And today itself, we were looking at how sponsorship and money play a role in research, and some of them were asking questions about how people with money then can have better access. So I think when they sort of listen to you, they'll get more clarity in terms of, what we were discussing as well. Last question. What do you do to keep the spirit of working alive, because you are an academic, you're a mentor, you're a pedagogue, and how do you spend your free time, or rather is there free time in academia?
So this is something that I learned the hard way, and maybe I'll give my secret away, is that very early on, stay away from toxic people. Okay? And who is a toxic person? Your heart will tell you. And your heart will tell you how, if you're deeply, deeply connected to your intuition. Okay? First, academy is hard anyway. Research is hard anyway. Writing is so hard for me. I don't know about you all. Oh man, writing is so hard for me. I look at, an open, just word blank document, sometimes for just like several minutes. I look out of the window and I think, how is it that this jumble in my head, the ideas will have words, and will come out? It's so hard. Maybe there's one school of thought saying that, okay, like you need to be mentored by hardness, and you have to be hard, and you need like really serious critics around you. They will always be there. You don't have to even search out for the critics. They will crawl out of the woodwork to attack you. Okay? Nurture yourself. Learn to give time to your good friends. Learn to have a community, build a community of people who nurtured you, so that you have, during your weakest and your darkest moments, you have the ability to call them and say, I'm feeling like shit today. And they will tell you it's all right. Even through the phone, they'll say, get a cup of tea, I'm going to sit with you. Right? And one thing we really don't talk about in the academy and as researchers is this space of nurturing and affection we so deeply need, is the space of affirmation. You may say that I've written so many things, books, articles, and I'm confident all the time. That's absolutely not true. There are moments of such darkness I go through because I have no clue what I'm doing and what I'm going to do with my data. And I have these amazing friends that I just call, not many, few, because not so many people have time all the time. But it also means dedicating that space, right? And how do you create light around you? And so stay and retain the joy. Stay and retain the joy. And I think that in itself becomes a soul food for us. A colleague of mine recently told me, there's so many things that go on in terms of racism and race violence here. I'm right now, in the United States for a fellowship, and she told me something very profound. And for me, that was a balm, on my soul. And she said, actually, the work of racism, Toni Morrison once said, is distraction. So we have to ask ourselves as researchers, when we are giving a comment to one another, when we are reading one another's drafts, are we doing the work of construction, or are we doing the work of dismantling? And I think some of us grew up in the academy because we come from marginalized communities. We come from communities where we are for the first time learning to write an academic paper. And that was my own experience. It is just the fear that's in us. And I think it really helps for us, especially, who are from marginalized communities coming into academy, to never forget that moment and to retain that humanity as we read each other's work. And, there's no harm in saying, good job, you can do it better. All right, this is it. Right? And so I think that in itself is so important, because the magic is that if you care, there's a space to care in the academy. If you care and if you really practice the process of sharing, I'm telling you, there's something magical in that. And I think that's why we say that love is magic. right? Because we are unable to explain how is it that if we give 1, 10 comes back. And it's that magic that I have constantly witnessed, even in my life. The other source of joy that I retain, being in the academy, is also community engagement. So I work a lot with the Naga people. I think there are very few of us in the International Academy, Naga social scientists, as you might be aware. So I'm constantly going back home when I'm in India, listening to students, mentoring students. Very early on, I always tease Naga students. When they see me, they run the opposite direction, and I run after them. So one day I asked them that, do you so not like me? But they were like, we are so intimidated and afraid of you. So when a lot of students see me, they run, and I said, don't do that, right? Don't do that. So anyway, I tease them, I laugh at them, but I think that community engagement and also retaining the space, for one another, to just say that, good job, that we are here for one another, and I think then it itself goes a long way, and that's what sustains me.
So thank you so much for all the thoughts and ideas that you have brought to the conversation. And both of us thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you, listening to you. And I hope that our viewers, listeners, and readers also feel that way. Thank you so much, Dr. Kikon, for taking time out.
Thank you so much.